This week, we're joined by Dina Gilio-Whitaker, a citizen of the Colville Confederated Tribes. She is a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University. She's also known for her environmental advocacy, her teaching of traditional ecological knowledge, and she's also an award-winning journalist, contributing to sources like Indian Country Today and High Country News. She also joined Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in the authoring of the book All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. And her most recent book is called As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock, which came out in 2019. And today we're going to be discussing that book, among other things. So
Yeah,
we
and,
welcome Dina.
yeah, and we recorded this prior to the inauguration of President Biden. So some of the things we talk about are anticipating what Biden is going to do, such as cancel the Keystone XL pipeline and kind of roll back Trump era policies. But nonetheless, I think the conversation that we had is very pertinent because it doesn't, these actions don't fundamentally change the colonial relation of the United States towards indigenous people. And so that's what, I found pretty fascinating about this conversation. There's a lot to dig into. I think the other element of it is how Biden has, moved us into what could, ostensibly be called a green revolution with big scare quotes, meaning that we're going to, undergo a massive transition towards renewable energy sources, which is going to require all kinds of mining and mineral extraction, as we can see, with Trump signing into law certain or rolling back or fast tracking, I should say, environmental, reviews in places like the Oak Flat, which is a sacred site to the San Carlos Apache people, and Apache Stronghold has been resisting it since under Obama, who passed Resolution Copper into law to turn that site, which is a U.S. forest site, into around a 2 mile kind of wide crater in the earth for an open pit copper mine, which ostensibly will be used for the renewable technology like electric vehicles, which Biden has pledged to turn, the entire federal fleet into, electric cars and
Mm-hmm.
transition away. So these are things that we were, talking about how the extractive colonial model kind of remains the same, even under a Biden administration.
Right. Yep. And she called a lot of things, not only in her book, but in this discussion we had. And it's been interesting to kind of see these things play out since we recorded this in real time.
Yeah, so we hope you enjoy this podcast. We have two more coming up. We interview one of the matriarchs, Carla Tate from the Wet'suwet'en Nation, on the 1 year anniversary of the RCMP raid of Unistoten Camp, and also Ann Spice, who is a Tlingit scholar and activist. That'll be coming out not next Monday. And then after that, we have a special interview with migrant justice organizer Harsha Walia. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dina. All right, so we are joined today by Dina Gilio-Whitaker, who is the author of As Long as the Grass Grows, which is a book by Beacon that came out in 2019. It frames, a lot of kind of environmental justice issues in connection to indigenous, decolonization, as well as thinking through settler colonialism. But Dina, Jen, and I also have a personal connection. And in fact, Dina was a early participant in forming what later became, the Red Nation as an organization. And Dina was actually there with Andrew, Melanie, and I, and thinking about creating an online journal of sorts called the Red Nation, and then it became more of a political organization.
Very
um,
quickly.
yeah, very quickly. Yeah. But yeah, and also Jen has a personal connection to Dina. I don't know if you wanted to bring that up, Jen.
Sure. So, I was really honored to meet Dina at the American Studies Association conference in, I want to say like 2017 or 18. It was in Denver, and we're all hanging out, after the panels. And I don't know if you remember this, Dina. I won't take offense if you don't, but we had dinner, and then we ended up at like a boba tea shop or something in downtown Denver. And I was familiar with you, Dina, at the time, and it was just, this was my first time seeing scholars like outside of the scholarly realm and just having like everyday funny conversations. And so we're in this boba tea shop, and you start telling us about this just ridiculous Mormon story. You started telling us about Mormons, and about this one leader in the Mormon church who was like on acid and building these weird contraptions. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh my God. Oh, I of course I remember that meeting, and I remember that boba tea shop, and it was so cold. And Roxanne, it was because Roxanne and I were on a book tour,
Oh,
and
that's right.
yeah, so Roxanne and I had been on a book tour all over the country with that first book, and so going to that conference was part of it. So we did. I think if I'm remembering that right, I think that's how it went.
So,
Um,
what is the acid tripping Mormon story?
oh my god. Oh my god. Okay, let's see. How can I keep this brief? It has a big backstory that I'm not so sure I want to relate. Say all of the details without incriminating myself. But it had to do with where I was living up in Northern California with an old friend, and he was an ex-Mormon who still had ties to the Mormon Church, and who was really working to like deprogram himself from Mormonism, but he still had these ties and these friends. And we came in late at night from being out, and this friend of his was visiting from down in LA, and we walk in the door, and like there's all this crazy equipment in that, like this electronic equipment, and like all these crazy drug paraphernalia, and this old guy, he's like in his 70s. His name is, I'm probably like committing some horrible sin by disclosing all this. God forbid anyone listening to this, but
He's a subscriber, so it's cool. No, I'm
but
just kidding. I don't know.
he was this like very very well known elder scholar of the Mormon Church. He'd written like dozens of books on Mormon theology and all this, and it was just like one of the most bizarre scenes I'd ever walked into. And they were taking, it wasn't LSD, it was ketamine actually.
Oh my god.
And they're injecting ketamine. Like,
Ooh.
it was crazy. And so we were like, whoa, what the hell? And the next day, we all went out to breakfast and had a conversation with this guy. He explained to us that he was working to like change the Mormon church. Like he knew that there were things about the church that were really a problem. And, I don't even remember. I mean, this was so long ago. I don't remember exactly all the things he identified, but clearly we can imagine what those things were. But he said that, in order to transform the church, transformation had to happen on three levels. It had to happen on the interpersonal, the intrapersonal and relationships, and the institutional. And so he was working on transforming his own consciousness through psychedelics, basically is what he was doing. which I thought was very interesting. Um, but like certainly an unusual methodology for a Mormon.
I don't know. I've read parts of the Book of Latter Day Saints, and it's pretty out there. I think Joseph Smith might have been on something when he
Goaded.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So
Well,
anyway, yeah, I remember it was a great time, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, Nick, about being there for the kind of inauguration of the Red Nation, and it beginning as a just a like a Skype conversation, and where you guys have taken it to where it is now. It's like it's so impressive and so like like kudos, man, for the work that you guys are doing. It's amazing.
well, thanks. And a lot of it is very much influenced by your work, and I think is very much in conversation. And actually, in fact, when reading this book again, revisiting it for this interview, it brought me back to kind of our kind of origin story. At Standing Rock, I think it was your first trip there, and it was my like fourth or fifth, I can't remember, but it was at the end of November. Trump just got elected. There was a really dour mood in the country, in the sense that the kind of only alternative, or the only like protest movement, so to speak, was at Standing Rock. And this was actually around the same time. It was like around, it was at the end of November. It was around so-called Thanksgiving. I actually detail it in my book. We stayed the night at a Wyoming gas station. It was like cold as hell because the interstate closed down, and we
And it
stayed the
was
night.
Thanksgiving night.
Yeah. For Thanksgiving night, we rolled in like the next day. And I don't know if you want to just like maybe talk about that whole experience, because I think all of us in some way had like personal, political kind of like changes at that time. And that was like 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago. And now here we are. Like, and so much has happened.
So much has happened. Yeah, it's definitely full circle, it feels like. Um, because it was, yeah, it was November and we had just gone through that hideous election. And I think we were all still kind of in shock that Donald Trump was going to be president, and we all knew what that pretended. So that's sort of like the subtext, or certainly part of what was going on. And the Standing Rock conflict was we knew it was historical. I mean, we knew it was going to go down in the history books as some major event that would be pivotal in so many ways. And um, that we were kind of on the, and I mean, I know that I wanted to go. I was still in the middle of this book tour with Roxanne. This book tour that we were doing it happened over about 2 or 3 months. We had been all across the country, and I'd have gone to Standing Rock sooner if it hadn't been for all these book talks that we had to go to throughout the rest of the country. And so finally, like Roxanne and we were in Minneapolis the night of, was it November 21st, the night of the water cannon attack? I think,
That would be or wait,
I think
uh,
it was,
yeah, it was
it was
November. Yeah. It was right before Thanksgiving.
right. So Roxanne and I were in Minneapolis. We had just done a talk um, through Birch Bark Books, and we were like in the hotel watching this thing on live feed, like people being shot with water in sub-freezing temperatures, which means it was lethal force. So it was just shocking to watch that. And we were going home, I think, the next day, and I had some time because it was going to be Thanksgiving. And so that's when I don't remember how we did it, but I hooked up with you, and because you were living in Southern California at the time, and we just um, arranged to drive out there together with our friend Catalina.
Mhm.
And it was just like, finally, we have to go. We have to go. And me, of course, for you, like you said, you had been there already a bunch of times, so it was part of your routine at that point. But for me and Catalina, it was like, us and 15,000 other people who had the opportunity to go there because it was a 3-day holiday or 4-day holiday. So the timing of it was pretty amazing. And then I was able, because I was working with Indian Country Today, on an assignment to do some interviews while I was there and be there as media. But yeah, it was it was such an intense time period that I don't think anybody, I couldn't have predicted, like, the impact that it was gonna have on my life personally,
Mhm.
and in my case, it resulting in a book. I mean, I certainly didn't, that was not part of the plan, but that's in fact what happened, because I was asked to write that book by, the editors at Beacon. So, the timing, and it was right up my alley as a scholar, somebody who had studied in environmental justice. We should also say, by the way, that the other way that the 3 of us are connected is through, the University of New Mexico,
Oh, that's
because
right.
Mhm.
we're all students there. We all came out of that university, and, I think that's an interesting statement. I mean, UNM is putting out some amazing, people doing amazing work, and I think it should be said.
Specifically the American Studies department.
Yeah,
Um,
well, and I came out of Native American Studies too, and Jen, I don't know, did you come out of Native American Studies there?
Yeah, I did actually. I have my BA in Native American Studies. I double majored in Native American Studies and American Studies.
Yeah, and so my BA was in Native American Studies too, and then my MA was in American Studies. And I think, Nick, you arrived right after I graduated.
mhm. Yeah, I came in 2012, I think. The fall of 2012.
Uh-huh. And I had graduated in 11, so just the year before. But I had known Melanie, because Melanie were and I were in the same cohort, and just kind of befriended each other because we were the only other Native people in the program.
Yeah, and at Standing Rock, just I just want to point this out because it was kind of like, the historic in many regards, but when we were there that weekend, I think it was like Bonnie Raitt. They're having that concert, that fundraising concert, at the casino, and we just happened to
Jackson
meet.
Brown and
Yeah,
Bob.
we've met like Bonnie Raitt, Jackson Brown, that guy from Black Eyed Peas. I can't remember his name.
Taboo.
Yeah, Taboo. But more importantly, we met. I think. Well, I mean, I had met Cooney Dog before. He's just been around for quite a while, but we met Bill Means, and then also Dave Archambault Sr., who is the father of the chairman, Dave Archambault Jr. at the time. But what was really interesting is like I got a chance to just talk with them briefly uh, when we were there, just because Bill Means, was influential in the International Indian Treaty Council, which helped launch the kind of UN work,
Yeah.
for the American Indian movement. But also, Dave Archambault Sr. was the council member in 19. He was a council member at Standing Rock in 1974, and at that time, nobody wanted AIM anywhere near the reservations, but Standing Rock Council had actually invited them there to host the first treaty council meeting.
Mm,
So it was kind of like very historic, very full circle, in the sense that like the Treaty Council, the International Indian Treaty Council, formed because of the work at Standing Rock, and then in 2016 you had the Ochete Shawkoni Camp and Sacred Stone that were created at Standing Rock as well.
yeah, and I also got to meet, Madonna Thunderhawk and her
Mhm.
daughter Marcy at that time. That was the first time I'd ever met them, and I was pretty starstruck, being able to have a very long conversation with her. somebody, one of the old Aimsters and, movers and shakers in the Red Power movement. So yeah, so many different levels at which it was such a profound experience.
So, Dina, are you down to just jump into talking about the book?
Sure.
All right. So first off, I want to say I love this book. I mean, for me personally, it really helped me understand like a lot of the legal context around environmental justice issues and like that history. And I didn't know a lot of it, and I think you do a really good job of talking about it in a way that is like easy to understand because like doing my BA in Native American studies, I just like dreaded learning about tribal law because the jargon is so heavy sometimes and just getting through legal documents is like hard for me personally. So I really appreciated the way you like consolidated and gave such a good clear analysis of like all of that aspect to um, environmental justice and how historically it's functioned within the state apparatus, but also outside of it. So my question is simple: why did you write this book?
The answer is really simple. It's I wrote the book that I wished that I had had when I was a student.
Hmm.
And
Awesome.
yeah, and it was because I had been I'd well, okay, going back a ways, I went back to school as an older person, so like non-traditional student, and I had come back to school as an activist. So I had been, what I call like a street activist, working on Native issues, and I always considered myself like a environmentalist, since the 80s. Like that was the thing that drew me. So, I had just, and then I had gradually gone into doing activism around Native issues in the urban environments where I was living in California. And eventually, went back to school and I kept studying like the environmental stuff, even though I was in a Native American studies program. I was still, looking at taking courses on environmental issues of various kinds. And so there was a course in the Native American Studies department called Environmental Justice, and the course was sort of like it was the stuff that we were reading. It was like cobbled together, kind of. I mean, we were reading. There was almost no literature written by Native people. There was one book, and the book was that one by called Defending Mother Earth that was
Hmm.
edited by Jace Weaver, and it was just a little thin book, and it had like some kind of case studies in it. And that was the only material I remember reading that was written by Native people for Native people about Native issues around, around the term environmental justice. And then there was some other stuff that we read that was sort of peripheral to that. So then I got into the American Studies program, grad program, and there was another course called Environmental Justice. And all of the material, that was, of course, much more in depth, but we didn't read any Native authors. We read no material about Native issues and environmental justice. So I kept in that grad program, all of the work that I was doing was related to environmental issues in one way or another, and bringing that Native American studies lens to it, and trying to look at it through that. And so all of the research that I was doing was related to these environmental issues and environmental justice issues. So I ended up doing a thesis. In the meantime, I had moved back to Southern California, where I was from, and I moved to this town called San Clemente, which is this little beach town, and like it's known for its surf culture, and it's like known to be kind of like the epicenter of the surfing industry. And so I've learned about this story about how this famous surf break that's here called Trestles. It's world famous. Like, you can't overstate the how famous and important this place is.
And you yourself are a surfer, by the way, just so
Right.
people know.
Right, right, which is one of the reasons, like, all of these issues sort of converged for me. So I found out how there was this development project, this road was going to be built, that was going to most likely destroy trestles, destroy the wave quality of trestles. And, like, once it was known that that was potential, it was they the surfers first. It started with the environmentalists that weren't necessarily surfers, like the Sierra Club. So the Sierra Club jumped on it, and started looking at the because it's a watershed. It would have this road would have traversed or would have paralleled this creek called San Mateo Creek, and it's said to be one of the last remaining pristine watersheds in Southern California. And so this road would have been built basically in the creek bed, totally disrupting it, thus sending all the sedimentation downstream to the surf break and then ruin it. But at the same time, this is also the location of an ancient village site called Panhe, and it's a documented historical site that had been eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So it was very well documented, and it it turns out that when they finally, so the whole thing, the long and short of it was that the toll road was defeated. So all of this activism uh, what came together with these various diverse coalitions to stop the permitting of this toll road. And one of the pieces that was so instrumental in that process was the fact that this Native American sacred site was there and in the middle of all of it. And so that's what I wanted to look at, like, how much did that the fact of that influence the Coastal Commission's decision not to permit that toll road, because it had nobody'd really looked at it. It was like the whole story was like, oh, look at how the environmentalists won this fight, and the surfers won the fight with the environmentalists, but they constantly overlooked the piece of the native community and the sacred site and the role it had to play in all of it. So it was just such a rich site to do an analysis, an environmental justice analysis. And that's really where it came. So it was like I could then do this, write this book that, like, well, here's the stuff that I wanted to know when I was a student, like the questions that weren't being addressed, like how does environmental justice look through the lens of through an American Indian analytical lens.
Yeah, and just something I've learned from you is like surf culture has been very much taken over by like this kind of by whiteness, for lack of a better term, but in fact it's an indigenous practice, right? And so I'm really glad you brought that up, because I from reading your work, and you've written about surf culture and where it comes from, and the various kind of ways that it's connected to settler colonialism and the way it's been like co-opted in some ways. But just to kind of take a step back, I was wondering if you could just maybe break down what you mean by environmental justice, and the reason why, in this book you make it very clear, but the reason why indigenous people's views on land and nature, are so central to your understandings and frameworks. And then you make a move to say like there should be an indigenized environmental justice. So maybe you can just give us a background on EJ, as it's called, or environmental justice, and why its frameworks were insufficient for indigenous rights.
Yeah, so that goes back to, if you look at the history of the thing that we call environmental justice, which is, when we talk about that as sort of a broad umbrella term, it really refers to the history of activism. It refers to theory in the academic sense. It's and law and policy. So it's like sort of like this big term to describe a bunch of different things, and of course it begins through the activism of in the early 1980s of Black communities down in the South who believed that they were being targeted for toxic waste dumps, and so through that activism to stop that, like that famous book Dumping in Dixie, to stop
Hmm.
dumping in Dixie. um, they it led to studies. So like the communities, those Black communities organized, it led to studies, and they came up with this. They suspected that it was racism that was at the center of all of it, and they called it environmental racism. So that's what they studied. They looked to see, if this is actually really a thing. And according to the studies that communities and then later the government did, it turned out that that was something that you could actually name, that this thing called environmental racism. And so this is, a very particular articulation or a manifestation of racism that happens through environmental processes. And so this literature starts emerging, and this it becomes a field of study, and it becomes law, right? Law and policy. In 1992, you see the Clinton administration officially adopting, he passes an executive order defining environmental justice, and what environmental justice should be. And so it enters the officially enters federal legislation, and the legal lexicon and all of that stuff. And so, but it's based on this concept called environmental racism. Well, that's seeing in my argument is that looking at these processes of environmental injustices through the lens of race really is not enough to understand indigenous experiences of injustice. And as I argue in the book, like, so indigenizing it means that we have to be able to understand these broader histories of genocide and land theft, because all of that for Native people were environmental injustices. All of that, when the process to separate Native people from the land is itself environmental injustice. And so the ways that federal law and policy look at environmental injustice through this very narrow lens of race is not enough to understand things like the doctrine of discovery and forced assimilation. And so this is the stuff I'm looking at more and more. I think like when we talk about in the US racism and it being sort of the irreducible injustice, or sort of like the original sin of the United States, I disagree with that. And I think for Native people, it's so much deeper and so much broader that we have to have an analysis that is beyond this racial. It goes beyond the racial binaries and that racial lens. And so I think understanding environmental justice through this is one way to do it, but we have to do more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. So when some comrades and I were reading this book and discussing this book, we ended up talking a lot about how solidarity between Black and Indigenous liberation struggles have um, been rooted in environmental justice issues, but more specifically, our relationship to the land and our historical relationship to the land, which I think when we reduce things to race, that conversation just kind of gets lost, and really talking and naming environmental colonization gets lost. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, because we see this environmental colonization continuing to happen, right? Like in New Mexico here. I mean, New Mexico might as well be one big sacrifice zone. That's how it's treated and continues to be treated. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, where I'm going with it, like, so there's your question was kind of multi-layered, I think. The environmental colonization, I think, is um, ways that we are speaking about it specifically with relation to native populations. Like it's, we have to be able to cast this larger net when we talk about it. But again, going back to that question about what race has like, what does a racial lens have to do with it? How does that serve us, or how does it fall short? And I and also, where does the coalition building break down between native populations and black populations? And that's something I'm looking at in my next book. How can we bridge those gaps and become better allies to each other? How can we enroll the support of Black activists in working to help dismantle settler colonialism? Right. So that means going
Mhm.
beyond that racial analysis. But so for me, it's so the next this book that I'm working on right now again came from as an idea from my publisher. They were like, what does white privilege look like through the lens of settler colonialism? And I talked about it a little bit in the book, in the environmental book, by using the term settler privilege. And I just used the term, and I didn't build out a definition of it. But in this next book, that's what I'm doing. And I didn't even invent that. I'm going to say that right off the bat. That's not my creation. I actually came across a study by a woman who's now a friend of mine, who identifies herself as a white settler, and she is part of that hippie commune called Black Bear Ranch that I wrote about in As Long as Grass Grows, which is this Northern California hippie commune that is struggling with this. They're actually looking at how to decolonize their land, because they were, founded on this very problematic um, moniker called "A Free Land for a Free People." Like that's their moniker, like their motto. And so they started to look at it. Well, what does that really mean? 50 years later, they started talking about this.
Sounds like Israel.
Oh my God.
Right? Right. Yeah, and so it became this conversation. This woman, Laura Hurwitz, was a grad student at Humboldt State writing a master's thesis on this thing. Like, she'd been a long time resident of the ranch, and wrote about her experience, wrestling with these very difficult questions about being settlers on stolen land. And yet at the same time having all these, hippie values of, freedom and, whatever else. And so she wrote about this, about settler privilege, and theorized it. And I was like, oh, this is brilliant. And it was brilliant even more so because it came from her as somebody who's a white settler, like identifying that. So that's what I think. I think that's the big, like, when we talk about justice in the United States, that and now, like the Black Lives Matter movement has really, with renew, because of the George Floyd killing last year, and all, the uprising, or the renewed uprising. I don't know how else, what else we could call it, because it's never gone away, but
Mhm.
it sort of like sparked again in this very intense way. But it's now I've been struck by the fact that in kind of the media spaces, this idea or this term white privilege is really has gained a lot of currency, even in the mainstream, which kind of blows me away. Um,
Yeah.
and then Robin DiAngelo wrote that book, White Fragility, and like, so these we have these terms that are sort of on the table now that aren't so, they're not pushed back. So you have liberals are starting to use, white liberals are starting to use this language, um, but oh god, I just totally lost my train of thought. Oh, so we can talk about, to some degree, we can talk about race and the fact that racism is still so very much foundational in the United States. But the elephant in the living room in the settler state is the fact of genocide and land theft. Like,
Mhm.
so like accountability, like there has not been any kind of process of settler accountability for the state that's built on profound disinformation about itself. And that's the conversation that I want to have. Like, how do we extend it beyond, take it beyond that racial analysis so that we can understand the settler state and bring an ethic of accountability in a much more, a much deeper, more meaningful, just way.
That is so needed right now. I'm so looking forward to this. I'm constantly challenging people who use that term as a catch-all, and it's honestly
Mhm.
almost becoming meaningless at this point to like actually consider power relations when they're talking about privilege, because I think that's what they actually are trying to describe. But yep, white privilege really falls short. So I'm so looking forward to that, Dina.
Yeah, and I think there's also the term privilege, like its original meaning, from like Middle English or even like Latin, related to like a bill or a law affecting an individual, right? And so
Mm,
it actually entails like legal rights. And so I think settler privilege is a good term, but also, I think you pointed out, Dina, and also Jen, that it can kind of fall into that murky realm of being co-opted and rendered meaningless, as we know in this current day and age. But I also think that, like, if you look at, you document this very well. If you look at things like, water settlements, the settler state is intervening on behalf of, this unidentified kind of collective or the nation, right? To protect their interests, always against tribal interests, right? When you look at water settlements and things like that, and even when you look at the creation of, or the writing of the U.S. Constitution, the debates were about protecting settlements, right? White settlers who were invading indigenous territory.
yeah,
And by protecting, I mean like literally sending out the military to protect their advances into indigenous territory. And so privilege isn't just this kind of like innocent word. It's actually a rights-based framework for settler people against indigenous, against indigenous kind of claims or indigenous governance specifically. But you also emphasize, the fact that environmental issues differ for different kinds of people. And maybe we should just elaborate a little bit more on that, especially when it comes to like farm workers and Black communities, as you pointed out earlier, and indigenous peoples, and that like homogenizing this kind of broader kind of environmental issue, or environmental racism doesn't really get to, the kind of specific issues that Native people face. And I think like a concrete example of that would be how, and this isn't a criticism, it's just the fact that this is how it exists. But like, Earth Justice, the environmental firm that was legal firm that was representing Standing Rock, was using an environmental racism framework to make claims against the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? And Jen brought up earlier the framework of environmental colonization. So, how do we think about this in terms of like thinking about especially the militarization of Indian country? The kind of adjudicating body in all of, in Standing Rock was actually the Army Corps of Engineers, which is technically a branch of the military. And that's something, we grew up understanding as, like when I grew up on the river, that very river, the Missouri River, Minnesota, we understood after 9/11 that there were certain things we couldn't do anymore because it was actually like a military unit that was controlling everything, whether it was shoreline erosion to the adjudication of surface water and how it was allocated for irrigation, all of those kinds of things. And I think it kind of gets glossed over a bit. And so I was wondering if, this is like a multi-layered question, and I apologize, but I was wondering if maybe if you could kind of tease that out, especially that militarization aspect.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I didn't do in the book. And, there's always, I don't know about you, but, kind of hindsight is always 2020. And you think, when you write a book, I don't know, like in this case, what I think back of, oh, I should have done this and I should have done that. And one thing I didn't do in the book was uh, you know, do an analysis of the military aspects of it. But, the way that you just articulated it was so right on. I didn't do that. But I think that there's room there, and it certainly needs to be done. I think our colleague and friend Christina Uhas Wood did an entire dissertation on environmental justice and militarization. So, point to there, but not specifically related to Indian country or Standing Rock. But I think, and in terms of what you were mentioning about Earth justice, using that environmental racism, framework, that's all they had, right? Because
Right.
that's what the law is built on. And so my argument is that that's what has to change, like in these analyses, and laws ultimately have to be capable of understanding. And this is the problem, this is the conundrum that the settler legal system is fundamentally incapable of doing. I mean, I don't know how we do it without kind of unraveling the entire foundation of the doctrine of discovery and the trust doctrine, all of that stuff. I mean, we have to, I mean, I suppose you could start with, when I'm thinking through this, like, how do we expand uh, an analysis into the legal realm where the law can be more responsive to these broader ways that Native people are environmentally impacted. And I suppose you could start with rewriting Executive Order like 13275 or whatever it is, that was written by Clinton in 1992, by including specific phrases relative to Native people that understand that broader history of colonization as that which impacts Native peoples and their and the centuries of dispossession. So, like, I think you can start there, but this stuff has to be incorporated into the legal into the in structures, like all the structures of the U.S. And although it's not happening in so much in law that I know of, I do know that there's this kind of language is seeping more into other areas of federal management, like in the conservation world. There are in like land management practices, like in the federal government, they are starting to incorporate. Like I'm thinking of like uh, burning, cultural burning. So people who are doing cultural burning, there's some really good studies coming out by Native people within the federal institution. I'm thinking of a guy named Frank Lake in particular, whose work is really strong that way, and other Native scholars whose work is in doing work in environmentalism, writing about how these frameworks need to inform the ways that the federal government works with tribal nations. And it seems to be happening more and more, I'm happy to say, but hopefully that can expand. I will say something interesting too that I uh, found out the other day, in regards to the Biden-Harris administration, incoming administration, they've been talking a lot about environmental justice. Like they've been really highlighting that in a lot of their policy platform stuff that he's been talking about for a long time. And so they had this webinar that happened just the other day, and I got invited to it. And the webinar was just about for environmental justice people to see like what kinds of positions that they're going to be hiring for in this this transition team. And so it was pretty straightforward and pretty basic, but what it looked like to me, it wasn't like, oh, we're hiring an environmental justice czar or something like that. It was more that they kind of showed this is how, and it was very instructive. I didn't know that this is how it works, like with a presidential administration and how they actually staff, their teams. So they have this thing called the Plum Book. Have you ever heard of it?
No, I've
No.
never.
It's very
Is it like
interesting.
a is it like a plum colored book?
No, no, I don't know why it's called that, but it's called the Plum Book, and it's basically a directory. It's like 230 pages long or something, and it's just a directory of job positions in the federal government. So, based on different agencies, and so they were saying, if you are from an environmental justice community, like that's the language that they use, and so they're appealing to people who are activists and like in the nonprofit world and stuff like that. They said that, so you study this Plum Book and look at all the different kinds of jobs that there are, and look and see where your skills as an environmental justice like community member or activist, where your skills could best be suited. So it looks to me like they are trying to get as many people as they can with environmental justice backgrounds and sort of infuse that within their administration that way, which I think is really interesting. I mean, I don't think it's something I'm going to look into, but it was very instructive to see the approach that they're taking, and they seem to be serious about it. So
Well, I don't get invited to things like that. I'm just kidding. But I would actually be interested to know like what the Obama administration did as well, because it seemed like they expanded some of that stuff too. But I don't know.
yeah, I don't think my my perception of it is that they didn't have and I guess comparatively to other administrations, that may be true, but they didn't make, from what I can see, great strides in the realm of environmental justice, at least not for us as Native people. I mean,
Mhm.
look, I mean, that's why Standing Rock happened.
Right.
Standing Rock happened because they didn't do, effective consultation. So where was that environmental justice ethic? You know, I don't
Right.
I don't think it was there. I mean, and Obama waited till the last freaking minute, December 4th, when
Mhm.
they stopped it and said, "Okay, we're not going to grant that final permit because oh yeah, I guess we didn't really, I guess meaningful consultation really wasn't done after all."
Right.
Which is what the Standing Rock Tribal Council had been saying all along.
But I mean, the reversal of that decision by Trump actually shows how arbitrary, you know, Obama's, move to make, oh, we have to do another, impact statement, or we have to do another study to know the full risks. It's like it just shows how arbitrary, and in my opinion, in my assessment, how authoritarian it actually is, because it's not a
Totally.
democratic decision who decides
No.
how these things go through. It's just whatever bureaucrat happens to sit in that position, who's rubber stamping these kinds of things.
Exactly. And that's why it's a hegemonic process. It- yeah, so that's why it's, fundamentally a structure, a settler colonial structure for native
Mhm.
people. I mean,
Hmm.
there is no real justice for us in any of that. Um, it's still governed, all of it is still governed through this framework, this legal framework that was designed to keep native people dispossessed. I mean, in the long run, that's in the big picture, that's what it is. And so until that legal foundation is transformed, it's always going to be that way.
Mhm.
It's always going to be the US government as the hegemon, as the arbitrator of justice. Well, I mean, that's like the fox guarding the hen house,
Mhm.
always.
Right. So speaking of consultation or the lack thereof, I wanted to shift gears a little bit and actually inquire about the title of the book. So if, one who hadn't gotten around to cracking open the book might think the title was, premised in some flowery, indigenous philosophy, but it's actually a quote from President James Monroe in his speech to the Cherokees in 1817, and I want to read it if you don't mind. It says, "You're now in a country where you can be happy. No white man shall ever again disturb you. The Arkansas River will protect your southern boundary. When you get there, you will be protected on either side. The white shall never again encroach upon you, and you will have a great outlet to the west. As long as water flows or grass grows upon the earth, or the sun rises to show your pathway, or you kindle your campfires, so long shall you be protected from your present habitations." And so my question is, did you like, was it intentional to choose a piece of this quote? And if so, was this to highlight the false promises made by the US to indigenous people that are ongoing that like facilitate this homogenizing process?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was for. I mean, there's a that was not the only that phrase, "as long as the grass grows," was used a number of times in numerous treaties and other addresses to Native people. So that wasn't that was, to my knowledge, when I was looking back, that was the earliest articulation of that phrase. And then there's like several other treaties where the phrase gets used, and so it's really basically a big lie, and just a bunch of BS that the US has always, you know promulgated against Native people. And um, so yeah, I mean, so you're right. It wasn't some flowery statement, evoking native relationships to the land. It was a statement evoking the duplicity and criminality of the federal government.
It's as authentic and sincere as Iron Eyes Cody crying on the side of the river, the fake ass Indian. I posted that on Twitter the other day, and some people were like, he's a fake Indian," because it was in response to the Alberta like premier who was like complaining about the potential reversal of the Keystone XL pipeline, and I put the Iron Eyes Cody with the tear coming down his eye.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, they didn't get the humor there, I guess.
Yeah. um Speaking of which, I think we should maybe think about, because you brought it up a little bit about Biden's administration, and there seems to be, I'm a skeptic. I'm 100% a skeptic, just because I felt like there were similarities with how Obama got kind of like rushed into office, and all of these, promises, and this is going to happen, and people are saying, well, Biden's environmental policy is the Green New Deal without the Green New Deal, label. But he's promising all these things, and you mentioned that they're doing this, this kind of like job search, this massive job search for like environmental justice people. He's intimated that he will, it's been reported by the time this podcast actually airs, we'll know whether or not this is the truth. But he said that he's going to cancel the presidential permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, and is considering, a whole host of other kind of, transformations for like a quote unquote green economy. And I just want to get your assessment on a lot of this because, I have my own reservations, no pun intended, about especially the Biden administration, because this guy is like the product of the Obama administration. He never once commented on the Dakota Access Pipeline when he was in office. I don't know what his stance on Line 3 is. I don't know what his stance with like the Rio Tinto, copper mine and Oak Flat. I don't know his stance on a lot of these issues. And to be honest, he told a group of donors last year that nothing will fundamentally change under his administration. And so
Yeah.
I would just like to get, your assessment and maybe even an assessment of somebody like, Deb Haaland, who was his cabinet pick for the Department of Interior.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I'm a skeptic too. I just, when you know history, when you've been paying attention, you there's no reason to be sanguine about it. you know I mean, and it is problematic and troubling that he said nothing will change. And no, I have not seen much from Biden about any particularly strong stance about supporting tribal sovereignty and transforming that relationship. Is it nice that Deb Haaland is received that nomination? Yeah, it's nice. But we have to be realistic about the fact that it's still the settler government. Does that mean that there isn't some good things that can come of it? I think that there can be, potentially, especially if they restore Bears Ears. That's one of the things that's on the agenda, as I understand it. They want to, restore Bears Ears. That would be a good thing. I know one of the things that has been big on her agenda is protecting protections for Chaco Canyon, and I'm sure a lot of other things. I think that there is good that can come of it, but it remains to be seen because the structure is still fundamentally what it is,
Mhm.
and it's the structure that's the problem. So, all you have is a revolving door of people and personalities coming in and out of that structure that's already there, that's, you know, designed not for us, not for justice for us as Native people. So I'm skeptical. I'm just sitting back and waiting, and we'll see what happens. But I don't have a lot of good feelings about it. So we'll see.
So that being said, I know in the book you of course argue that settler colonialism is inherently an environmental issue and that Native people are always already implicated in environmental justice efforts by default. But you also talk about wanting to bridge the conversations that take place among Native people, which includes like activists and academics, but also taking those conversations to the environmentalist sphere, which includes nonprofits, governmental departments, even tribal governments. So knowing that there's not too much faith to be put in the Biden administration, how do you envision this collaboration amongst these various institutions, movements, and individuals moving forward?
So I think that we have to work. There's a lot of different levels and a lot of different dimensions where environmental policy happens, and so we have to be able to infiltrate all of those arenas. And given the fact that the environmental movement is now really powerful and really influential with these big NGOs, that have all their lobbyists and influence in the political system, then we need to be able to have their ear and convince them. It's like people say this, like you hear black activists say this and other activists saying it's the hardest people to convince are white liberals. Like they're the people that need to change more. They're some of the staunchest, most racist, most um, blind people to these issues of anybody. And so, like, that's why that's my audience. That's who I want to convince, who I want to educate, so that they can make their own transformations in their own consciousness and help transform the system. So looking at transformation at these different levels, like I learned about from crazy Mormon all those years ago.
We're gonna have him on the show. We're gonna find him and have him
Oh,
on the show.
he's
We're gonna all
dead.
take ketamine together and have a conversation.
Oh yeah.
The things that happen in your life, like when you get old, like
We're gonna look for golden tablets in the desert after doing a shit ton of ketamine.
yeah, I mean, it's just like it was that crazy story, but I learned something from it, and that's like I'm drawing on that now, and that's like 25 years ago, and I'm still drawing on that. Like, God, yeah, it was crazy, but he had a point. Like, I really get where he was coming from, and so yes, how do we transform society? How do you get to how do you transcend these profoundly unjust systems, and in a country that is built on disinformation, as Eric Chaffetz has argued in his book, The Disinformation Age, which is an amazing book, by the way. I highly recommend it if you don't know of it. Um, where he argues that really the U.S. is built on a system of disinformation, especially in recent years, and the way that that's perpetuated in these liberal spaces. I mean, even Obama, did his own version of disinformation all those years. But like, how do you transcend all of those mythologies, all of those lies that the country is based on, that indoctrinates people in such a way that you have a state of mass delusion, right?
Mhm.
We see that. Somebody wrote about it. I think it was in the New York Times or maybe the Washington Post, talking about the coup attempt from last week, saying that it was, all these people, like all these radical, they're not even conservatives anymore, these people. These are the radicals now, these armed militia, white supremacists, um, nationalist groups, um, that have been so prone, like this cult, like this Trump cult, and then like the subcults under that, like the QAnon cult. Like these are people who are in a state of mass delusion. Like, how do you really honestly believe, so much so that you are, go to the Capitol and think you're gonna, to do a coup on the American system of democracy? Like, you really think you're gonna do that? But and it's fueled by all these crazy conspiracy theories. So it's like this state of mass delusion, that's so obvious now, but when you think about the US and what the US really is, it's always been that. It's always been founded on um, a reality that's not fact. Because how do you say that the United States is, this beacon of democracy and, freedom for, and justice for all, and all these, platitudes that we're all so used to hearing because we were indoctrinated with it, when the reality is that this country was founded on the most profound kind of violence, and land theft. Like it doesn't, it's not logical. It's
Mhm.
not logical. And so it's this massive like cover up that we've all been, indoctrinated. So how do we transform that? How do we dismantle that and have an honest conversation?
Where can we find your work, Dina?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know. I'm not really publishing. I mean, I'm not really putting anything online these days. Um,
How about social media?
yeah, I'm kind of stepping back from social media too. I mean, Facebook, I'm not very active on Twitter.
So what you're saying is that we can find you tripping ketamine in the desert looking for gold tablets.
I'm not saying that. You can find me surfing at Santa Onofre
There
from
you
time
go. That's a good place.
to time. Yeah. Um,
Well, thanks so much for coming on. And yeah, we look like Jen said, we very much look forward to your next project.
yeah, well, it's great chatting with you guys
Yeah.
for all your great work.